Hello, hello. This is video 2 for this week. We are talking about more logical fallacies. So, the first logic fallacy that I want to talk to you about is not on the list of the 10 commandments of rational debate. Neither is the next one. So these are two extra terms to add to that list that are related but not quite in those 10. First is appeal to authority. And if you remember in high school, several of you may have been taught about different forms of rhetoric and persuasive discussion. And your teachers might have talked to you about logos, pathos, and ethos. Ethos is related to authority, one's character or one's bearing one's weight in the community, being a means of persuading someone that they are correct or to agree with them or to believe them. So that is fine, except when it is taken to an extreme, and then it becomes a logical fallacy. So an appeal to authority is a fallacy when you make an argument on the basis of someone's authority alone, or when you make it the basis of your argument when in fact that person is not an authority in the thing that you are talking about. So when you want to determine whether or not something is a logical fallacy related to an appeal to authority, what you need to do is first to determine whether or not the person who is being appealed to is in fact an authority in that particular topic or not. So do they have a PhD in that topic? Are they a recognized expert in that topic? If so, then they are someone that you can appeal to without it being a fallacy. Their take on a topic can be appealed to without it being a fallacy. But also notice whether or not the argument that you are assessing does nothing but appeal to that person's authority. If all it does is say, well, that's an expert and therefore I believe it, it is not a very strong argument. There's got to be more to it than that. So let's get into some examples of appeal to authority so that you have a better sense of what qualifies and what doesn't qualify as an appeal to authority. So with a little bit of background for this example, Fran Hodgson was a feminist and journalist for the New York Times who was really famous in the late 70s and early 80s and made famous particularly the topic of what's called FGM, female genital mutilation, a practice that generally takes place in parts, although not all, of different countries in the continent of Africa. So this is the claim, and then let's talk about whether or not the claim is an appeal to an authority or not. Here's the claim. Surgically removing a woman's clitoris and or labia in Sierra Leone is a violation of her human rights because, according to Fran Hodgson, female circumcision robs a woman of the ability to enjoy sex. So let's think about this logically. The statement is that Fran Hodgson says it does this, and therefore it is robbing someone of their human rights. So what would Fran Hodgson need to be in order to be an appropriate expert, an appropriate authority? Fran Hodgson would need to be a medical doctor who is particularly expert in the field of assessing the effects of female genital cutting. She's not. She would also potentially need to be from a community in Sierra Leone that practices this and is aware of the impacts that it has or doesn't have on women's lives. She's not. So the fact that she is a feminist and a journalist for the New York Times does not make her an authority on this topic. We need a great deal more to be able to agree to listen to what a person has to say other than that they are a feminist and a journalist from the New York Times. Not to say that journalists cannot become experts on certain topics, certainly, but that there is, particularly in something like an epidemiological question like this, that this is a general violation of human rights, we would need more than a journalist to assure us of that fact. We would need an epidemiological expert to be able to tell us the widespread impacts of something like traditional practices in some communities in some countries in Africa. Okay. Next up, the IPCC is an intergovernmental panel on climate change. They are considered the premier international organization for coordinating climate policy across the whole globe. So that's the background information on them. Here's the statement. So assess whether or not this is an appeal to authority. The IPCC argues that our weather patterns are becoming more extreme due to man-made pollution based on thousands of studies by hundreds of different research teams that indicate that connection. So, is this a fallacious or false appeal to authority? No. Number one, the IPCC is, like I mentioned, not a single person, but it is the premier organization for determining this. They bring together hundreds of experts on their panel, and they have amassed and assessed and analyzed thousands and thousands of papers, research papers on this topic. So it's not just them saying it, but it's them saying it because they have tons of evidence to support them. So pointing to anything in this sentence as an appeal to authority is difficult. There's nothing here that is a fallacious appeal to authority. Okay, background on this one. Kevin Bales is a professor and a co-founder of an organization called Free the Slaves, and he's written a lot of books on what he calls modern day slavery. So with that background, here's the sentence. There are 27 million modern day slaves because Kevin Bales estimates that there are 27 million modern day slaves. Is this a fallacious appeal to authority? Is Kevin Bales an authority? Yeah, he is. But the way that this is phrased puts it into appeal to authority territory because it is based on nothing other than one man who is claiming something and not getting into his evidence for it. So the way this is phrased just makes it a flimsy enough argument that it does qualify as an appeal to authority, even though Kevin Bales is considered to be a well-regarded researcher on this topic. And it turns out that even though he did publish this number, and this number is widely circulated, he does not have any good evidence to back up this number. He sort of just made it up, took it out of thin air. We're going to talk a lot more this semester and in the book Humankind in particular about faulty science or when and how to trust publications that purport to be expert and yet maybe are not as well founded or documented as they claim to be. How about this one? Clearly, it's a good idea to use public funds to pay for students to attend private schools because Betsy DeVos, a billionaire political donor, supports it. So pause and think. Who's Betsy DeVos? She is a billionaire political donor. So because she supports this idea, then it's a good idea. Is that an appeal to authority? Yeah. She's not an authority on the topic of educational policy. She's a billionaire political donor. And also, it's based on nothing other than her opinion. So these together combine to make this absolutely an appeal to authority in the way that it's stated here. Okay, the next term that's not on the list of the 10 commandments of rational debate that I also want you to know Last was appeal to authority. Next is appeal to emotion. So if appeal to authority is ethos, appeal to emotion is pathos, if you're thinking back to your high school lectures. So appeal to emotion is an argument that attempts to manipulate the hearer, the listener, by making them feel something rather than by convincing them with logic and evidence. So it might be persuasive to make you feel something, but it's not sound logic, it's not sound critical thinking to convince someone based only on emotion rather than logic and evidence. So I'll give you a few examples of appeal to emotion. Here's one that you've probably heard when you were little. Eat your vegetables because children in Africa are starving. Or if you didn't hear it, definitely other people heard this. So also this is a non sequitur if you're thinking back to our terms from the last set of slides. There's no relationship between you eating your vegetables and what happens to children in Africa. So this is both an appeal to emotion because it's trying to make you feel sorry for the children in Africa and therefore get you to eat. But it's also a non sequitur because there's zero relationship between those two things. Here's another one. Don't vote for that politician because it would make your grandmother turn over in her grave. So trying to get you to do or not do something based on your attachment to another person in your life rather than based on logic and evidence. So what does your abuela think about it rather than what's the logic and evidence for doing this? Okay, here's another one for you. Did you see that video on TikTok of the starving polar bear who is so thin it can barely walk? We have to do something about climate change. So attempting to get you to feel sorry for the polar bear and thereby pull you into action related to climate change through that sadness for the starving polar bear. So this is an appeal to emotion. It's not good logic and evidence. It's maybe one data point, one tiny little data point in this massive sea of information about climate change that should move you. But the way it's phrased here is specifically trying to appeal to your emotions. All right, so those are those two terms other than the 10, appeal to authority and appeal to emotion. So let's get back into the 10. We did the first 5 in the last video. We're going to start with 6 here and go through 7, 8, 9, and 10. So we're going to do straw man fallacy, hasty generalization, begging the question, post hoc fallacy, and false dichotomy in this video. All right, first up, straw man fallacy. Think about this as someone attempting to take a sword and fight with a scarecrow rather than fighting with a real human. That's what straw man fallacy is like. So when you represent your opponent's argument and you dumb it down or you oversimplify it in ways that misrepresent it in order to make it easier to dismiss or easier to defeat as a set of ideas, you are engaging in what is called straw man fallacy, sometimes also called scarecrow fallacy. So I'll give you a few examples in the next slides. Here's one related to gun control. Gun advocates want to get us all shot by abolishing all gun laws like background checks, licensing, safety requirements, waiting periods, registration requirements, and so on. Okay, there may be a few gun advocates out there that believe all this. They want to have absolutely no laws whatsoever. But in reality, that's not what most gun owners believe. It's not what most gun owners vote for. So you are attempting to make them out to be scarier or more easy to dismiss or defeat by misrepresenting their position on the question of gun ownership in this way, by overstating it so much that it seems really kind of crazy. All right, next up. Straw man fallacy. So this is taken from reporting last year from the journal Inside Higher Education, and relates to a professor here in California. This is a quote from a professor here in California. Excuse me. The professor said people were protesting him because, quote, I say there should be peace between Israel and Palestine. They, the protesters, don't want peace between Israel and Palestine because they don't want there to be an Israel. They want to see the largest Jewish community in the world somehow destroyed, he said. Whether the people are killed or exiled, they don't say. Okay, so what is this professor doing? He is misrepresenting the majority, vast majority of people who came out to protest on behalf of Palestine, and vastly misrepresents what most people who want some changes and support and help for Palestinians, what they believe. So to overstate their position, to say that they want, in fact, Israelis to be killed or exiled, is to make it easier to defeat what they are actually coming out to protest for. So this is an example, a very good example of straw man fallacy, misrepresenting in order to make it easier to get people on your side. All right, the next term is hasty generalization. Hasty generalization is to take a small group, maybe even sometimes only one person, and use them to represent a larger group. But that representation is a misrepresentation because that person or that small group don't, in fact, accurately reflect that larger group. Hasty generalization is one of the easier terms to learn this semester. So here's an example. NAFTA caused a lot of American manufacturing jobs to go to Mexico. Therefore, international free trade agreements are bad for the working classes. Okay, so is it true that NAFTA caused a lot of American manufacturing jobs to go to Mexico? Yes, absolutely true. But is it fair to take one example of a free trade agreement and use it as a generalization about all free trade agreements and their consequences for working classes? Maybe not. So we would need to do a better study than just have one example of a free trade agreement like NAFTA. We would need to know about many other free trade agreements to be able to draw the conclusion that they're bad for working classes. We're going to get to this later in the semester, but as this is stated right here, it's an overgeneralization. We don't know yet, based on one example of a free trade agreement, we don't know yet whether or not all free trade agreements are bad for working classes. Here is a much more straightforward form of a hasty generalization. The murders of Kate Steinle in 2015 and Laken Riley in 2024 by immigrants who were in the U.S. illegally make it clear that we should deport undocumented immigrants because they're clearly dangerous. So to take the murderer of Laken Riley and the murderer of Kate Steinle and to say, therefore, all people who are here without documentation should be deported is a hasty generalization. It does not, in fact, reflect the reality that most people who are here as undocumented immigrants actually commit crimes at a lower rate than people who are here or are naturally born citizens of the United States or naturalized citizens of the United States. So this is a hasty generalization. It takes a small group and misrepresents the larger group. Okay, last one for hasty generalization. The fact that the US elected Obama to be president proves that Americans aren't racist anymore. Proves that Americans aren't racist anymore. So taking one president and making that somehow prove your point is a hasty generalization. It doesn't, it's not enough of a data point. There are many other data points you could bring in that would speak in the other direction. So this one-off example, especially when we've never had another person of color, it doesn't do you much good. This is a hasty generalization logically. All right, next term is a little complicated, and so I'm going to give you lots of examples of it. It's called begging the question. So begging the question is to form an argument that is a restatement of the argument itself. So you state it, and then to prove your point, you find a way of just restating it with different words rather than actually supporting it with evidence or more logic. So it's a kind of a form of circular logic because the second statement just kind of draws back on the first statement. So it's called a tautology and means that it is circular logic. So this is also sometimes an argument that it makes its claim based on a foundation that has not yet been proven. So it states something and then moves on quickly and states something else based on that without first proving the first point. Those are both forms of begging the question. I'm going to call them Form 1 and Form 2, and I'll give you some examples of each of them in the slides that come. Okay, here is an example of Type 1 begging the question. The reason everyone wants to play Call of Duty Black Ops 6 is because that is the hottest game of 2024. Wait, so you're trying to prove why people want to play it, and your reason is because it's the hottest game. That's just a restatement of that everybody wants to play it. So you're not actually proving your point, you're just restating your point. So that is a tautology, that is circular logic, begging the question, Type 1. Here's another example of that same Type 1. Joe Biden has low approval ratings because people really dislike him. Same thing, right? It's just the opposite of the last one. He has low approval ratings because people really dislike him. Well, that's just the same thing. You just restated your point. You didn't prove why they don't like him by saying that he has low approval ratings or that he has low approval ratings because they dislike him. That doesn't make any sense, right? It's not actually proving the point. The point is, why do they dislike him? And bringing in reasons why they dislike him or why they disapprove of him is necessary to proving that point. All right, last of the Type 1, here's the final example for that. The International Studies Department requires students to study abroad because it is one of the requirements for graduating from our program. So why should you study abroad? Well, because we require it for you to graduate. But wait a minute, why do you require us to do that to graduate, right? Like, why is it a requirement? And also, why are you requiring it? You're just restating things in the way that this is phrased. So in order to explain why international studies requires students to study abroad, you would need reasons why, not just that it's a requirement. The reasons being that it improves people's chances of getting jobs later on, that it improves their performance, it helps them actually graduate faster, that it is a life-changing, very exciting experience. All of these are the reasons why we don't require it because, hey, look on this paper, it's a requirement, therefore we require it. That's a tautology. Okay, this is the second type that I was talking about where you state something and you move on before you prove the thing that you've stated to make your final claim. It's also a form of begging the question because the first thing is not yet proven before you move on. So here's an example of that. Since free markets are always best for the economy, it's a no-brainer that opening up Thailand's currency markets to foreign investors will be good for the Thai economy. Well, first of all, prove that free markets are always best for the economy. We're going to get into a ton of data on this in the last book, The Divide, that we're going to read this semester. It's a much more complicated story than that. So it's actually not a no-brainer that free markets are always best for the economy. And in fact, when they did open up Thailand's currency markets to foreign investors, they crashed the Thai baht, which eventually led to a entire regional currency crash in East Asia and led to a recession in that area for a while. So this was in the 80s that this the currency markets in Thailand were opened up to the detriment of Thailand and then much of East Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. So you can see how it's phrased as it takes a point, doesn't prove that point, and then moves forward as if that first point were true. So it begs the first question. All right, moving on to post hoc fallacy. Post hoc means it happened after the fact. So this is a form of logical fallacy that argues that something that happened first caused something that happened second, when in fact there was no causal relationship between the two, other than that one happened first and one happened second. So it's phrased usually as this happened and therefore that happened, when yes, one came first and the other came second, but other than that there was no relationship between the two things. So let me give you some examples of these. It's fairly easy to pinpoint. It always has an element of time in it, always. So here's a good example. A little bit old, but still historically accurate. The deaths of Muhammad Ali, Prince, David Bowie, Phife Dawg, and Gene Wilder early in 2016 probably swung the 2016 election in favor of Donald Trump. Now, did all these people, Muhammad Ali, Prince, David Bowie, Phife Dawg, Gene Wilder, did they all die early in 2016? And then after those deaths, then Trump won the 2016 election? Yes. But is there a connection between their deaths and his election? No. So to phrase things and make a connection that in fact is not causal is what's called a post hoc fallacy. So this happened first, that happened second. To claim there's a connection when there really isn't is a post hoc fallacy. Another example, another Trump example. After Trump took office in 2016, California started experiencing more fires than ever in its history. Clearly, the Trump administration has been bad for California's fire situation. So, is it true that we started having a lot of fires in California after 2016? Yeah, we did. It is true. But is there a connection between Trump taking office in 2016 and all of the many, many wildfires that we've had in California since then? No, zero connection. It is not caused by the Trump administration in 2016. Not at all. So post hoc fallacy. All right, new one, a false dichotomy. A false dichotomy is when you present something in a stark contrast, like a 0-1 binary, either fully yes or fully no, and no in between, no gray area. If that is how you present your argument, and it's in fact not a binary, it's not one or the other, it's not black or white, it's not all this way or all that way, but you present it like it is, that is a false dichotomy. So here's one example. We have no choice. As a nation, we either have to make the tough decision to cut spending on things like Social Security, healthcare, education, and infrastructure, or we'll just go deeper into debt. So here's a little graph of the state funding that's been cut for higher education after the recession. So is it true that we only have two choices? We either have to cut spending or go deeper into debt? No, in fact, there are many other choices that our government could make than just those two. There's a whole host of options other than those. Related to gun laws, another example of false dichotomy. Because of the Second Amendment, legally, there shouldn't be any restrictions on owning or carrying guns. So it's true that the Second Amendment gives the right to bear arms, but that is not the same thing as saying there can be no restrictions on the purchase, carrying, and use and storage of firearms. So it's not an all or nothing option, all guns and no restrictions, or no guns and all restriction. That is a false dichotomy. Okay, you may know the thinker Ben Shapiro, the media personality Ben Shapiro. So this was something he posted on his Twitter account, his X account, a few years back. I asked my 4-year-old daughter this morning whether she thought it would be more fun to have a job or be a mommy. She said, to be a mommy so I can cuddle my babies, which is really sweet and cute, of course, but it's a false dichotomy. You don't have to choose between being a mommy or having a job. There are many, many people who are able to do something in between and have both be a mommy and also have a job. Many, many millions of people accomplish that. It's a false dichotomy to present it as having to choose between the two. So that's it. Those are our 5 new terms, plus 2 that aren't on the list of the 10 rules for rational debate, 10 commandments. So they are appeal to authority, appeal to emotion, straw man fallacy, false dichotomy, post hoc fallacy, and begging the question, and last but not least, forgot that last one. Anyway, there's one more, but you can go back through and find the last one that I missed. So go ahead and take your quiz now, and remember as you take the quiz that as you type in the terms, make sure that they are spelled correctly, because you can't retake the quiz, unfortunately. So be sure that you are certain before you press submit on what it is you want to submit. Also, that I'm not using any uppercase letters with my answers. So good luck with the quiz, and have a wonderful rest of your week, and practice these logical fallacies during the rest of the week. Bye-bye.